Before beginning the rebuttals, let me make a couple of announcements. First of all, there have been pockets of children and maybe even older, more evolved human beings that have been causing a certain amount of ruckus. And if you could please, let's say, I don't know, babysit, maybe the best, most polite word, for those who are around you so that the individual gentleman can be heard as clearly as possible. Second announcement, audio tapes of this evening's presentation are available for $10 from Channel 65. Audio-visual tapes are available from Channel 65 also for a cost of $25. And they should be prepared, ready sometime next week. We have many questions, and I will try to filter through these as quickly as possible and present the better questions, or the most consistent popular questions, in about a half hour. We are now going to begin with the rebuttal speeches. First of all, Dr. Abele will have 15 minutes to respond to the positions offered and to advance the claims that he has made earlier this evening. Dr. Abele?
Well, it should be clear by this time that we're probably talking about two very different things. And so some of the comments will be a little bit difficult to answer, and what I'd like to do is sort of go in sequence and begin, since Dr. Gish cited Asimov as his authority, I would like to continue the quote. The only true closed system we know of in the universe is the universe as a whole. Within a closed system, there are subsystems that can gain complexity spontaneously, provided there is a greater loss of complexity in another interlocking system. Evolution can proceed and build up the complex from the simple, thus moving uphill without violating the second law, as long as another interlocking part of the system, the sun in this case, moves downhill at a much faster rate than evolution moves uphill. I don't think that he was rejecting the notion of evolution violating any physical laws. You know, one thing I better keep track of the time. One thing that my grandfather used to do in addition to discussing the Bible and science with me is play number games, and he enjoyed it quite a bit. And when I was younger, he would reward me with cookies. And I obviously still eat cookies. And one of the things he would do, he loved, what's the chance of drawing this card or that card out of a deck? And Dr. Gish has told you that the probability of life evolving, or a 124 amino acid enzyme, is very, very close to zero. Well, there's another event that's very, very close to zero, and let's ask ourselves the question. First, are his calculations correct? Yes, they are. That is, it's a combinatorial, factorial, and if we look around this room, we can say that, what do you think there are? 800 people here, 400 people? Say 400, doesn't matter. But let's ask this. Let's ask, what is the chance that everyone in this room is sitting in the exact sequence that you are right now? That is 0.94 times 10 to the minus 875th. That too is very close to zero, but obviously you're here. It depends clearly very clearly on exactly what you specify before you begin calculating probabilities. And my grandfather used to trick me on this all the time and take away Danish cookies that I liked quite a bit. So the first thing is to specify what we're talking about. We ought to specify, too, that I never mentioned origins. You can read Charles Darwin till you're blue in the face. He never mentioned origins. In fact, the definition of evolution that I gave you is from the National Academy of Sciences report. And this is the official advisory body to the U.S. government, Republican administrations as well as Democrat. I'm sort of surprised, actually, that Dr. Gish cited, I think it's pronounced Wickramasinghe and Hoyle. I've never met either of these gentlemen, but I have read what they have written. And I would say that they have concluded a lot of other things other than that evolution is impossible. And you can check this book out from the library yourself. It's called Evolution from Space, where they say that insects are smarter than humans, but they're just not letting on. Or you can find him saying that life on Earth began when microbes in space got caught in the tail of a comet and contaminated the Earth. And then, in court, and you can read the transcript yourself, he blamed the 1978 influenza epidemic on a virus from outer space. There's a lot of, they're very strange guys. Not only that, Sir Fred Hoyle, one of the books I read in preparation for this was written by Norman Newell. And you can imagine my surprise hearing him cite Hoyle and others is that he was one of the editors of this anti-creationist book. And it's Norman Newell, Creation versus Evolution, I think is the title. And I don't really know what his interests are. Well, you know, intermediate forms are like beauty. They're very much in the eye of the beholder. I showed you Amphioxus. I showed you the fossil Amphioxus. I showed you a whole series of therodont mammal-like reptiles. Showed you lobe-finned fishes. All of those, I submit, are intermediates. And, you know, like a lot of other things tonight, you're going to have to look at them and decide for yourselves. Why don't we take a quick look at a slide or two on insects. Now, I too agree that insect metamorphosis is a really interesting, in fact, phenomenal event, causing awe and wonder in anyone. But it's not inexplicable. It's not that this whole caterpillar dissolves into jelly and then reappears as an embryo, as a butterfly. There are cells in human bodies that do not turn on until relatively late in development. They're called regulatory genes. And there's an interaction between regulatory genes and hormones. Anyone who's raised children knows that, unfortunately. Well, there are two sorts of metamorphoses in insects. On the left is called hemimetabolous development, and on the right, the event that Dr. Gish described, holometabolous or complete development. There are about 26 orders of insects. Most have hemimetabolous development, some have holometabolous development. How did it come about? I don't know, but as far as the mechanisms underlying it, that's not a real big mystery. The interaction between hormones and genes in embryonic cells result in a reorganization of the caterpillar into a butterfly. These are cells that never contributed to the caterpillar in the first place. In fact, you can inject them with juvenile hormone and they will never undergo metamorphosis. Or you can collect them earlier in the molt stage, as he described, they undergo these molts, and you can reduce the amount of juvenile hormone in them and they become butterflies. So the mechanism is not that difficult to understand. It's the interaction between regulatory genes and hormones. Flight in insects is interesting. This is a flightless insect. I think this is the same slide that Dr. Gish used. We must have found the same book. This is a fossil dragonfly, and he's quite correct. There are no intermediate forms. Their insect flight shows up. But, as we see here, but insect wings, it's not any great mystery where they come from. They have sclerites on the dorsal surface, two on the side, and one underneath. And you can see in the development of insect wings in this dragonfly that part of that dorsal sclerite is involved in the formation of wings. Well, if the formation of wings is a mystery, look at the diversity of sorts of wings we see. This ought to be familiar to at least somebody here. Folding wings, anterior wings, posterior wings, and no wings. There are all sorts of things that one can find among the insects, and that's not necessarily any kind of explanation. So, what's the time look like at this point? What do I say in 5 minutes? I say that I hope you all had a good time, and that if you had an open mind, that you may start thinking about things a little differently. That you'll have to decide for yourself on intermediates, on Archaeopteryx. You saw its limb, and that was traced from the skeleton, and you saw the fossil reptile, and you also saw the flying reptile, and there's clearly no relationship between those two. That's really all I have to say, and I'll wait and sum it up in the last 5 minutes. Thank you.
I want you to notice, ladies and gentlemen, that Dr. Abele has described the process of metamorphosis and the process of how wings of insects develop, but he didn't explain how they originated. You see, it's an incredible mechanism involved here. And that's what we have to explain. Where did it come from in the first place? Of course, a butterfly develops from a caterpillar. Of course it does. It goes through the chrysalis. We know that development. We understand a lot about it, but where did it come from? How did that originate in the first place? Was the caterpillar first? And then did the caterpillar evolve this process whereby it became a butterfly? Or did the butterfly come first, and then in the meantime it evolved the caterpillar stage? You see, that's what has to be explained, and that is what is not explained, and that is what cannot be explained. The theory of evolution today, the modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, is essentially bankrupt. More and more evolutionists are abandoning the modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. Fact is, some are very, very definite about it. One of these scientists is Dr. Soren Lovetrup. Dr. Lovetrup is a Swedish scientist. He's not a creationist. He is definitely an evolutionist. But he does not believe that evolution has occurred slowly and gradually through mutations and natural selection. He says mutations and natural selection has nothing to do with evolution. He says evolution has occurred by big jumps, something you might call the hopeful monster mechanism. This was an idea suggested some years ago. The reason you don't find a transition form between a reptile and a bird, none ever existed. A reptile laid an egg one day and a bird was hatched from the egg. Just that way, you get a bird. That was actually very seriously suggested by a number of leading scientists. Must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile when that happened. Of course, no one has ever seen it happen, but they knew they had to explain why things just suddenly appeared. Now, this Dr. Lovetrup is a very well-known Swedish scientist. I mentioned he's an evolutionist. He wrote a book published in 1987 called Darwinism, The Refutation of a Myth. In that book, Dr. Lovetrup makes the following statement, one of his closing statements, quote, "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, what Dr. Lovetrup calls the greatest deceit in the history of science is what is being taught as fact in most major universities in the United States. I think that's rather incredible when one within the family, an evolutionist, would make a statement like that about a process that is supposed to be established truth. Dr. Abele said evolution or science is open and changeable. Yes, but not the so-called fact of evolution. You must never challenge that. You can challenge any mechanism, any phylogenetic tree, that's okay, but don't for a moment suggest that evolution is not true or that creation is true, or you won't get a job at that university. Now, Dr. Abele has mentioned certain fossils. He showed a slide of mammal-like reptiles, supposedly with no gaps. I'm not going to blame Dr. Abele for this. He doesn't know, I don't know where he got this slide. He probably got it from Dr. Ken Miller from Brown University. That data is fraudulent. I have the publication right here from which it was taken. That was pulled on me by Dr. Kitcher in a debate in Minnesota. And that time I had no answer. Obviously, there's no gaps there. You see a series of mammal-like reptiles. But I got the publication. The publication says 2 of these creatures are totally hypothetical. They've never been found. Furthermore, some of these creatures have hypothetical structures drawn in on them. They are not drawn to scale, and they are not arranged in a true time sequence. This did not precede that one. That did not precede this one. They were found in a different order, arranged in that way to make a plausible argument for evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, that's fraudulent data. Again, I say Dr. Abele does not know that. I'm sure of that. I don't think he did that dishonestly, but it was used dishonestly by evolution to support evolution. And I asked Dr. Kitcher, I wrote to him and said, if evolution is true, why do you have to use manufactured data to support evolution? The fossil record, I think, is very, very definite and clear on this. It is not evidence for evolution. It's evidence against evolution. What about embryology? Dr. Abele pointed out the fact that human embryos, as I understand, have gill slits. Ladies and gentlemen, a human embryo never has gills. It never has slits, so it never has gill slits. There are a series of pharyngeal pouches in the neck region of the human embryo which superficially resemble structures in the neck region of the fish which do develop into gills. In the human embryo, they're developed into the lower jaw, structures in the middle ear, and other glands and so forth. Never does a human embryo have gills. This idea that embryos recapitulate their evolutionary ancestry has been thoroughly refuted. It is not accepted by leading embryologists today. It's known to be false. When I debated Ashley Montague at Princeton University, I made that statement. He said, yes, that's true. And no evolutionist should ever use that discredited theory to support evolution. So-called homologous structures in different animals. That's structures that are similar in different animals. As Dr. Abele illustrated, the forelimbs. Yes, our forelimbs are similar to those of other creatures. He says that proves that we have descended from a common ancestor. It proves no such thing. It proves that there is a common design for common problems. As a matter of fact, the scientific evidence is so contrary to evolution based upon these similar structures found in different animals that Sir Gavin de Beer, the British evolutionist and biologist, wrote a little booklet at Oxford Biology Reader published in 1971 in which he titles it Homology, an Unsolved Problem. The scientific evidence is so contrary to what an evolutionist would expect based upon these similar structures in different animals that he says it's an unsolved problem. Homologous structures, similar structures in different animals do not develop from the same tissues in the embryo. Even embryos don't recapitulate. This idea of that there's vestigial organs, there's no vestigial organs. They have all been shown to have a function. And so that's no evidence for evolution. What about molecular biology? Mentioned by Dr. Abele. Well, I have a book here written by Dr. Michael Denton. Dr. Denton has 2 earned doctorates from British universities, one an MD degree, another PhD in molecular biology. He's not a creationist, he's not a Christian, he's not a believer, but his book is a devastating critique of evolution theory. It's called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. Dr. Denton is now in genetic engineering research in Australia, a world-class expert in genetics. On the flap of the book we read, the theory of evolution is propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by a practicing scientist presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution. Later on we read, most important of all, the discoveries of molecular biologists, of whom Michael Denton is one, far from strengthening Darwinian claims, are throwing more and more doubt upon the correctness of the whole theory. So Dr. Denton, a molecular biologist, says molecular biology does not support evolution. It is contrary to evolution. And we can see some of that data. I will have to... Here is a slide taken from Dr. Denton's book. He points out, if you compare the cytochrome of this Rhodospirillum rubrum, a microorganism, to that of the horse, which is a mammal, to that of a pigeon, which is a bird, to that of the tuna, which is a fish, and to the silk moth, and to wheat, and to yeast, you find that the number of differences are the same. The number of amino acid differences in the proteins of cytochrome C between that microscopic organism and all of these organisms are the same. There's the same number of differences. In other words, the silk moth is supposed to be much closer to that organism than a horse. To tuna, the fish, is supposed to be much closer than the pigeon. But look, there are no differences. There are no intermediates. There are no transitional forms. The same is true of the cytochrome C, of the silk moth, if we compare it to these various organisms. If we compare the cytochrome C of the silk moth to the horse, or to the pigeon, or to the turtle, or to the carp, or to the lamprey, we find the differences are essentially the same. There are no more differences here between this and the horse, which is a mammal and therefore supposedly evolved recently, than the turtle or the carp, which is supposed to be a primitive fish. And the same thing is true of hemoglobin. We take the hemoglobin of a cyclostome, a lamprey, supposed to be a primitive fish. Now, the cytochrome, the differences between the lamprey and the carp, then should be fewer than the differences between the lamprey and the human. But the differences between the lamprey and the carp, 75 differences. The difference between the lamprey and the human, 73 differences. You see, there are no intermediates. The carp is not intermediate between the lamprey and the human. There's no such intermediates whatsoever. And that's true of the mollusk, if we compare that to the lamprey, the carp, the frog, the chicken, or the kangaroo. We find there are no intermediates. There are no transitional forms here. The differences are the same. And other evolutionists come up with the same conclusions. Gregory Warr and Christian Schwabe, both evolutionists, point out that if you look at various molecules, such as the relaxins, a hormone, at insulins, you don't get a phylogenetic tree at all. You get something that is contradictory to what evolutionists would erect on the basis of their phylogenetic trees. What Dr. Denton emphasizes is this: molecular biology, the data from the molecules, does not provide intermediate forms at all. It shows the same discontinuities that the fossil record produces, the very same discontinuities. Now, Dr. Abele mentioned all you people sitting right where you are now. Why don't you just calculate the probability of that happening? Now, I'll admit, it's practically impossible that there you are. But ladies and gentlemen, when you came into this auditorium, it didn't make any difference where you sat. You didn't have to arrange yourself in precise order in order to create an enzyme or a hormone or anything like that. Any arrangement will work. And so you just came in and sat down. No mystery about that. But supposing that I would beforehand take your names and put your names on a seat, and then you all came in and just sat down randomly, what would be the probability that all of you would got in the seat that I had designated? The probability would be zero for all practical purposes, you see. This is a rather juvenile argument against probability. Someone would say, look at the probability of all of us being here tonight. The probability is impossible, yet here we are. Oh, I would agree. If we got here by chance, there wouldn't be a one of us here, but we didn't get here by chance. You saw an ad about the debate and you made an intelligent decision, or otherwise, to be here, and here you are. You see, you didn't get here by chance. But if the amino acids to make hemoglobin have to be arranged in precise order, that you can calculate that probability. It's not going to happen by chance, you see. Now, Dr. Abele, and I've noticed evolutionists have done that. When one of their fellow evolutionists turn against evolution and come up with scientific facts that supports creation, then you want to run down that person. You want to ridicule that person. Look, Fred Hoyle, Sir Fred Hoyle, is a brilliant scientist. He is a so brilliant astronomer, some people suggested he should have been given a Nobel Prize. Now, I don't agree with Fred Hoyle that life got here from outer space. I don't believe that. Why doesn't Fred Hoyle believe that life was created right here? He does believe, based upon science, that if life exists, it did have to be created. And see, that's the important part, because that is what is based upon science. That is what is based upon good, hard scientific evidence, you see. Now, Dr. Abel mentioned the Grand Canyon. I'm sure glad he mentioned that, because there is all kinds of problems for evolutionists in the Grand Canyon. Evolutionists used to believe the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon. They can't believe that anymore, because they believe the Grand Canyon area, the Kaibab Plateau, was uplifted 65 million years ago. They now believe the Colorado River formed only 5 million years ago. Now, if the Colorado River came along 60 million years after this area was uplifted, it would not run up over that hill and go down on the other side and cut a canyon. It would just run around it. And so they do not have any explanation for the origin of the Grand Canyon. And material on the surface of the Grand Canyon, which would have to be younger than the Grand Canyon, by radiometric dating methods, gives the date of 1.2 billion years, which means it's got to be something wrong with that radiometric dating method. And we get many, many similar dates that are absolutely, totally wrong. We feel that there must be something wrong with the dating method. Well, we've run out of time. We'll come back in a moment. Thank you.
Dr. Gish said that that slide that I showed of mammal-like reptiles contained fabrications unknown to me. I can assure you of one thing, and that is that I was very careful in my preparation tonight. And in fact, if you take a look at those, you will not see intermediates, and I'm glad that Dr. Gish has that particular paper in front of him. It's hard to read. I didn't realize I was going to have to do this because this slide didn't come out too well. But in fact, the generic name of each of those mammal-like reptiles is written under it, and each of those is based on a fossil specimen in a museum, just like I said it was. And that anyone is welcome to stop by or call or write, and I will be happy to give them both the names of those genera and the fossil specimens and their location where they were based. I realize there's a lot of hypothetical things in the literature, and I avoided those. He also made a comment about, Dr. Gish did, about De Beer, and I would like to continue the quote from De Beer. Quote, "There is no doubt whatever that the forelimb in the newt and the lizard and the arm of man are strictly homologous, inherited with modification from the pectoral fin of fishes 500 million years ago." There's so many books on evolution, and it just seems to bring out the worst in everybody. And some of them are written by scientists, some not, and they have a great diversity of information in them, some very strange. For example, this is a book on evolution, and it's called The Everlasting Golden Yoke. And in it, he goes on that the creationists don't know what they're talking about, the evolutionists don't know what they're talking about. And in there, he has a page, and this is a figure from that book. His evolution of evolution is that an adult bacterium fuses with an infant to become an adult pinworm. That becomes a sperm, which fuses with another one to become an earthworm, or every living species on Earth. So citing from books that have problems with one thing or another, anybody can do that. There is one answer, though, that I think that I would like to give, and that's a scientific answer. And that, to a lot of questions, the simple answer is, I don't know. That's what makes science so exciting. That's what makes science open to future developments. I would also just mention that most of the errors in science are corrected by other scientists. If you take the time to read the history of Piltdown Man, which is really fascinating, and I recommend it to you, or Nebraska Man, or all of these other things, science, one of the characteristics of science is that it's self-correcting. Think about a young person starting out wanting to make a name for themselves. One of the easiest ways to do it would be to go after the big guns and show them to be wrong. People have done it. Continental drift, for example, has successfully overturned the notion that continents are stable. And the people who overturned that idea have made quite a name for themselves. Scientists, like everyone else, have egos. That still doesn't take away from the fact that a good answer to a lot of questions is, I don't know. I don't know about origins. I do know that the available evidence that I have seen and reviewed indicates that life originated once on the planet Earth and that all life on Earth is related by common descent. Thank you.
I have the book by De Beer, just quoted by Dr. Abele. On page 8, indeed, he says this: "There is no doubt whatever that the forelimb," excuse me, let me get my counter going right here. Well, okay. What he says is, "There's no doubt whatever that the forelimb and the newt and the lizard and the arm of man are strictly homologous, inherited with modification from the pectoral fin of fishes 500 million years ago." Ladies and gentlemen, that is a statement of faith. That is simply a statement of faith. That's what he believes. Later on, right below that, not quoted by Dr. Abele, he says this: "So, in the newt, that is an amphibian, the forelimb is formed from trunk segments 2, 3, 4, and 5. In the lizard, from trunk segments 6, 7, 8, and 9. In man, from trunk segments 13 to 18. There's no recapitulation. There's no embryological similarity here. The forelimbs of the newt develop from trunk segments 2 to 5. Those of the lizard develop from trunk segments 6 to 9, and man from 13 to 18. That's why he says homology is an unsolved problem. It's not following the script. It's not doing what evolutionists say it ought to do. Finally, he points out that the genes which govern similar structures in different animals are totally different. That is, take the vertebrate eye. All vertebrates have the vertebrate eye, the so-called vertebrate eye. If you look at the genes that govern the eyes of a fish and what other characteristics they govern, and then look at the genes that govern the eyes of man and what other characteristics they affect, it's totally different. Then he has to conclude that the genes which govern the eyes of a fish and the genes that govern the eye of man are totally different genes. And yet he says these homologous structures, these similar structures, have been inherited from a common ancestor. Hey, wait a minute. If that happened, we would have inherited the same genes from the common ancestor, and those genes should be the same. This is what he says: "It is now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of homologous structures from a common ancestor explained homology was misplaced. For such inheritance cannot be ascribed to identity of genes." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure you understand what I'm getting at here, but you can understand this. The scientific evidence related to the inheritance of these similar structures in different animals is totally contradictory to what would be predicted by evolutionists. That's why he called his book Homology, an Unsolved Problem. And I have an article with me published by Dr. Roth in 1980 or later, which he says what he said is still true. We still have it true. It does not support evolution. And so we find out in the geological column that Dr. Abele cited, we have this geological column. As he pointed out, it was arranged 50 years before Darwin ever published his book. And it was arranged by geologists who were creationists. How then could it be used as evidence for evolution? This was pointed out by David Raup, an evolutionist at the University of Chicago. He said the geological column is no evidence for evolution because it was constructed by geologists who were creationists 50 years before Darwin. And he says, furthermore, he thinks the creationists are making a mistake in trying to explain a orderly and regular progression in the fossil record, in the geological column that doesn't even exist. He says, we creationists are trying to explain that with our flood geology, and we're making a mistake because that regular and progression doesn't even exist. And so we see, ladies and gentlemen, that the very, very important scientific evidence, the critically important scientific evidence, is absolutely conclusively in favor of creation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a tremendous scientific case for creation. And I think it's just dreadful that here in the United States, where 86% of the American people, when they were polled nationally, said they wanted both creation and evolution taught in the schools, that evolution is being taught exclusively. I have confidence in our students. If they're presented with all the evidence, if they're presented with the evidence for evolution and the evidence for creation, they can make an intelligent decision. I say in our pluralistic, democratic society, in order to guarantee academic and religious freedom, that both viewpoints should be taught from a scientific point of view, and then the students should be allowed to make up their own minds. Thank you.
I know what it involves to prepare for a debate, and I know these gentlemen are incredibly well researched, and I think they just demonstrated those skills quite well this evening. In other words, their task was very difficult. I spent the last half hour filtering through questions. I have selected several. I think they reflect the general consensus of the audience tonight. A lot of duplication, a lot of good questions, a lot of silly questions, but we will begin. No particular order. Well, there is particular order to these questions, and I'm just going to pick, I don't know, Dr. Gish.
Yes.
Give you a chance to go first with the questions. Dr. Abele went at the beginning with the constructives. Dr. Gish argued that without divine intervention, all stars would die out and the universe will die. He used the second law of thermodynamics to predict this. How does this take into account the first law of thermodynamics?
Well, the question are two separate questions. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that no matter if you transform one form of energy into another form of energy, or matter into energy, or energy into matter, the total quantity is a constant. In other words, you can't get something from nothing, and you can't take something to make nothing out of it. Now that is tremendous evidence for a finished creation. Now, the second law of thermodynamics has nothing to say about the total quantity of energy. The second law of thermodynamics has to do with the quality of that energy. What can you do with that energy? What can you do with available energy? The second law of thermodynamics tells us the amount of available energy in the universe to do work is constantly becoming less and less. The amount of energy available to do work, useful work, is decreasing constantly, though the universe is running down and deteriorating. Now, when it's all gone, when the universe is dead, all that energy will still be here. All of the matter and energy in the universe will still be here, but it'll be a dead universe, you see. That's the difference between the first and second law. The second law tells us the universe is in the process of deteriorating and running down. Now, Dr. Abele said that Asimov said, well, you can use one portion of the universe, it can run down, while you're building up another portion of the universe. Well, actually, you have to have more than energy going from one part to the universe to another part. You've got to have more than energy. You've got to have some machinery to utilize that energy, just like the green plant. Now, furthermore, Dr. Abele says the sun is running down, it's deteriorating, therefore things are building up here. Well, I certainly agree the sun is running down. And so he says the complexity of the sun is being utilized to build up complexity on the earth. I pointed out, first of all, just energy won't do that. Secondly, where did the complexity of the sun come from? Where did that come from? You see, how can you explain the complexity and order of the sun? And if you suggest that that came from some other part of the universe, then where did that other part of the universe, where did its complexity come from? And you go around in endless circles, and you never explain where that complexity and order came from in the first place, you see. That's left unexplained. Of course, the universe, being an isolated system, couldn't create itself anyhow.
Dr. Abel, comment? No. Okay. Question for Dr. Abel. Dr. Gish used a rather humorous but oversimplified analogy about sweeping a junkyard into a 747. Will you please comment on the current lines of research in molecular evolution, self-catalyzing RNAs, etc.?
As I mentioned, one of the major areas of interest among a lot of different people, not necessarily evolutionary biologists, is the interaction of molecules and how they interact with one another. And RNA, some of the RNAs at least, can interact with one another. That is, chemicals themselves interacting in such a way as to replicate themselves. There's a lot going on in that area, but it actually doesn't have too much to do with the theory of evolution. And Dr. Gish continues to push the theory of evolution beyond what it was ever stated to be. And as I said earlier, the theory of evolution simply states that life on Earth is related by common descent. Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that at all. The theory of biological evolution, of course, would have to include the origin of life. If living things evolved, you've got to explain where living things came from. And if living things evolved, they had to have a planet on which to evolve, so you've got to explain where the planet Earth came from. And as part of a universe, you've got to explain where the universe comes from. Now, Dr. Abel says you should not include that in evolution. Pick up a book on biology at Florida State University. Pick up a biology book in your local high school. I guarantee you they'll have chapters on the origin of life and the origin of the universe. It'll include all of that. Evolutionists usually don't like to talk about it because they run into some insuperable difficulties here. But it certainly is part of evolution. Now, there's one thing about this origin of life experiments, and I've followed that for many years because I'm a biochemist. This is within my area of expertise. One of the first areas I became interested in when I got involved in this creation evolution question. At that time, evolutionists were very optimistic about what could happen, what they could do in this area of the origin of life. They felt that they could work out the mechanism, that they would be able to decide or to run some experiments to explain how evolution has occurred, the evolution of life. Today, I read those same authors, and they have become very discouraged. They are saying that all of these experiments either lead into a blind alley or they are simply irrelevant. And because what they have done in these past 30 and 35 years have just simply emphasized there's no way you can even get a simple sugar like ribose. You can't even get simple things, let alone the very complex molecules like proteins and DNA, and get a living cell. And I think what many of them, well, Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on DNA, he's given up on the evolution of life on this earth. He says life must have reached the earth from outer space, just like Hoyle is saying. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. That's just transfer it to another planet. And you have to admit it, life could not have evolved on this earth.
Final comment?
As I said earlier, one of the questions, or one of the answers, scientific answers to a question is certainly, I don't know. If you looked at the debates on the theory of the germs causing diseases in the 1800s, many people asserted that there is no way that germs can cause disease, and they cited so-called scientific evidence, and they cited a lot of different things. Simply because we don't know the answer to something doesn't mean it's necessary to invoke supernatural into science. Thank you.
Well, may I make one other comment? I'll just say this. It's not what we don't know that troubles me about evolution. It's what we do know. We do know the laws of probability.
Dr. Gish, why would God waste 400 million years first creating then extinguishing million forms of life before settling upon the current biota?
First place, I don't believe that. Second place, it's a theological question, and I'd have to give you a theological answer. When you ask a why question about God, that's not a scientific question. Has no part in a scientific discussion. If I were going to answer a question like that, I'd go to the Bible to get my answers. I think there are answers there. And I don't believe that that did happen in any case, but if we're going to get the answer, we'd have to get it from the Bible. And of course, the Bible does tell us that after creation, that man sinned and rebelled against God, and then that's when pain and suffering and catastrophes and diseases and death came into the world. God did not use that process to create. We are responsible. Blame man for all of these problems. Don't blame it on God.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second. We will have a great deal more time to address more questions if we could save the applause for the very end. Thank you. Dr. Abele, comment.
It seems to suit Dr. Gish to bring God into the picture when he wants to and not when he doesn't want to. I submit simply that the notion of using radioactive decay to estimate the age of the Earth, which he constantly says he doesn't believe, if he doesn't believe it, as he doesn't believe evolution, he spent a lot of time convincing you of that. I submit on that particular issue, the data are so overwhelming from so many different sources outside of biology and geology that it's simply uncontrovertible. Thank you.
Well, I say this. I don't care how this is. Essentially, basically, as far as creation and evolution is concerned, it wouldn't make any difference if it was 200 billion years. It wouldn't be long enough for life to have evolved on this planet. And the scientific evidence indicates that it has not happened. So it doesn't really make any difference how old things are. Now, I do say this, that in radiometric dating processes and methods, there are all kinds of assumptions. You have to assume that the decay rates have been constant, very likely, but we don't even know that for sure. Once a rock formed, if you date that rock and it turns out to be 680 million years old, you have to assume that that rock sat there for 680 million years with nothing coming into the rock and nothing leaving the rock. That's not very likely because these isotopes, these things are soluble in water and they can be leached out. Now, furthermore, when molten material comes up through the crust of the Earth, it carries with it these isotopes, or it already has lead isotopes and these other isotopes in them. How much was there to start with? How much has been added since? Well, you really don't know. You have to make a series of assumptions. Now, furthermore, you throw out everything that doesn't agree with what you assume to be correct. That's not a very, very scientific method. We can't do that in science ordinarily. At the Upjohn Company, where I worked for many years, if we tested 1,000 rats with a drug and 50 of them died, we couldn't report to the FDA, well, what a beautiful result we got on 950 rats and forget about the 50 who died. If we did that, they'd throw us out. But that's what's done in radiometric dating. If it doesn't agree with what you assume to be correct, you throw it out. Richard Leakey dated the skull 1470 repeatedly by what was supposed to be a good dating method, by the potassium-argon method, confirmed by fission track dating, confirmed by numerous kinds of fossils found with it. But now he tells us it's only 1.8 million years. He sliced off 1 million years somehow. I don't understand how the method works, how you can depend on any method. You use it repeatedly, you get a particular date, and you confirm it, and then later you drop 1 million years. I just have some very serious doubts about the process.
Dr. Abele, if life can be traced to a single cell that was formed by some combination of gases, then why can't an experiment be done to duplicate this?
There have been a lot of experiments that Dr. Gish referred to that demonstrated replication of organic compounds. One of the issues that we disagree on, and a lot of this is going to be he says yes, I say no, I say yes, he says no, is that this occurred over a period of over 1 billion years. The best evidence is the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The first life, prokaryotic bacterial life, showed up about 3.5 billion years ago. Well, if you ran that experiment under the same conditions for 1 billion years, it's highly probable you would get life.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what Dr. Abel is saying is time is a hero of the plot. That's not true at all. If you went to Las Vegas with $10,000 and you played those slot machines, it might be within a week you'd still have $10,000. You might even have more than $10,000. But I'll guarantee you one thing, if you stay in Las Vegas long enough and play those slot machines, you're going to be broke. Because they are programmed to return only a certain percentage. Now, on this planet, the problem is this. No matter what source of energy you use, ultraviolet light or heat or lightning or whatever you use, the rates of destruction of the products vastly exceed the rate of formation. In other words, if you form amino acids in one of these experiments, you do get a tiny amount of amino acids in electrical spark and gases. Those amino acids must be immediately isolated in a trap and removed from the energy. Because if those amino acids are once again exposed to that spark, they will be destroyed at rates which vastly exceed the rate of formation, by 1,000,000 to 1 or greater. The problem is, on the primitive Earth, you didn't have organic chemists with their traps, and there was no way to remove the product. And as they come down out of the atmosphere, they're burned to a crisp by ultraviolet light, they're destroyed by lightning, and so forth and so on. Now, furthermore, if you had a trap and you could imagine some natural way of trapping out the product, removing it from that energy to preserve it, that would be fatal to any theory on the origin of life. Because in removing the product, putting it in the trap, removing it from the energy, you see, you can't go to the next step. If you're going to combine amino acids to make proteins, you must have an enormous quantity of energy. But if you isolate those amino acids in a trap to preserve them from destruction, then you're dead. That's the end of the line. You can't go any farther. But if you bring in energy, if you bring in ultraviolet light or lightning, what happens? You destroy those products. So the clever organic chemist goes in the lab and he constructs the apparatus with a trap in it. And he declares to the whole world, look, I've created amino acid. Has no relevance to any theory on the origin of life whatsoever. You know that. If you get hit by lightning, you don't become more complex or more ordered, do you? You get obliterated. And that's what would happen even to amino acids. You just can't get any significant quantity of these, even simple substances, in these experiments, let alone proteins and DNA and a living cell.
You don't really think being hit by lightning, Dr. Gish, has anything to do with that experiment, do you?
Yes, but you see, Stanley Miller used lightning in his experiment, and he simulated lightning, but he removed the product, you see, and that's what I want to do. If I saw lightning, I run for cover. I don't run out and get exposed to lightning.
Dr. Gish, creationism appears to be built on negative evidence. Evolutionism can't be true because of this. Evolutionism can't be true of that. If creationism is a science, then it must deal with natural laws. Please present some independent, positive evidence for creationism without invoking the supernatural.
If you ask me how God created, I have to tell you I don't have the foggiest notion how he created. If I did, it wouldn't be creation. Now, I will agree, and I insist that science deals only with the natural. We don't invoke the supernatural in science. But that is when we're trying to deal with the here and now, with the world out there. That's the here and now. That's the real world. Now we try to explain how it operates. But if we're going to try to explain where it came from in the first place, how it originated, now we step outside of the limits of empirical science. As I pointed out, nobody was there. Now, to exclude the supernatural to explain origins is not fair. That means we all have to be atheists when we think about origins. I'm not an atheist. I believe God is real. I think we have abundant evidence for his creation. As a matter of fact, we are told that nobody has any excuse, because in the things that God has made, we can very clearly and easily discern certain unseen attributes of God. What is the positive evidence for creation then? I've described quite a bit of that tonight. The fact that these complicated creatures, the invertebrates and the fishes, appear fully formed without a trace of an ancestor. David Futuyma, he's written one of these anti-creationist books. In that book, this evolutionist said this: either animals have arisen from some pre-existing form, or they appeared on this planet fully formed. If they did appear fully formed on this planet, then indeed they must have been created as a result of some omnipotent intelligence. Now, I have pointed out that these animals have appeared fully formed. That's the empirical scientific evidence. That's what you see. That's the evidence. And if that's true, then they must have been created. Now, if this gentleman wants, or lady wants me to go in the laboratory and run an experiment and demonstrate creation, I can't do that, and I can't have God come back and create something. And of course, no one has ever seen evolution. Did anyone ever see an ape change into people? Did anyone ever see a fish evolve into an amphibian? The only thing we observe today are minor variations. We don't even see a new species coming into existence today. It hasn't even been witnessed. Naturally, no one has ever seen a new species originate, let alone a fish come into existence from a clam or a sea urchin or something like that. Evolution has never been observed. It is not empirical science, but we do have circumstantial evidence that is powerful support for creation.
Well, as I indicated earlier, Dr. Gish has simply removed the question from the realm of science, and that makes it very difficult to deal with. But I will once again point out that the lobe-fin fishes, the therodont reptiles, Amphioxus, and a host of others do represent intermediate forms. You saw the bones of a lobe-fin fish yourself. You saw a comparison between a pigeon wing and Archaeopteryx. And you saw a comparison of the jaw structure in these mammal-like reptiles. All of those represent intermediate forms suggesting evolution by common descent.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me point out, what Dr. Abele is talking about is the questionable, disputable cases. What I use as my evidence are beyond dispute. There's no question about it. I've challenged Dr. Abele time and again here this evening to explain how every major kind of fish could have appeared on this planet without a trace of an ancestor. How is it possible to have 100 million years of evolution as some invertebrate gradually becomes a fish, and we can't even find one single fossil? Now, that's beyond dispute. There's no question about it. And yet Dr. Abele has not answered that challenge. He wants to talk about Archaeopteryx and things like that, you see. And while we are saying that you cannot have a scientific theory about origins, we're not saying that origins is not science. We can talk about the fossil record. We can talk about the laws of probability. We can talk about the science of thermodynamics. We are bringing it within what we might call science. But these are not scientific theories. They're not repeatable observations. You can't construct theories to test. Creation, evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence, you see. We are in the domain of science, but we're not talking about, strictly speaking, scientific theories. Evolution is no more scientific than creation, and it certainly is just as religious.
Dr. Abele, given evolutionist theory of common ascent with modification leading up to man as he now exists, what form, functions, and mechanisms does the evolutionist predict man to pass through in another million years or so from now?
Well, given the second law of thermodynamics, we won't be here in a million years, I guess. I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I seriously doubt we'll be here in a million years, but that's certainly open to debate.
You see, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Abele has just admitted something critically important. What did he say about science? It has to be able to make predictions. And he says he can predict nothing about future of humans. And an evolutionist couldn't predict a million years from now whether a camel would still have 2 humps or would have 4 humps or would have no hump at all. They could make no prediction whatsoever. Dr. Abel can't make any predictions about the future. If evolution is scientific, why can't we make predictions? You see, it isn't science. It's not strictly science as you define a scientific theory. When you have a scientific theory, you can predict the results of your experiment. But he can't predict anything about the future of man.
What is your prediction of the theory of man in the future?
Well, I would take my predictions from the Bible. That's where I get my predictions. Humanly speaking, what we could say is this: we have a very bleak future. AIDS is going to wipe out millions of lives. And of course, if we got in an H-bomb war, we could all go in a blink of a second. I don't have one bit of worry about an H-bomb war, because my home's sitting high on a hill overlooking downtown San Diego, the largest naval base in the United States. The first missile would come right over my home and go off, and I'd be vaporized in the first second. I wouldn't have a thing to worry about. So I can't predict what's going to happen in the future if I were just left to my human devices, but I think I have some pretty good idea what is going to happen in the future. And I would say this: I believe God does control the future.
Dr. Gish, if God created the complex process of DNA replication, then is it not possible that evolution is a complex process created by God? Or is God not capable of such an enormous feat?
Of course, God did create the DNA molecule. We look at this complicated process that Dr. Abel illustrated on the slide, where you have to translate DNA into messenger RNA, and then you have to have transfer RNA, you have to have ribosomal RNA, numerous enzymes and all of that. You look at that very complicated mechanism. Of course God could have done it, and he did do it. What I'm saying, chance could never do it. The laws of chemistry and physics could never do that. Chemistry and physics don't work that way. Naturally, things disperse, they break down, they wear out. When I was in research at Cornell University Medical College, we were working with hormones from the pituitary gland. When we isolated these hormones from human pituitaries, other pituitaries, we put them in the deep freeze. We put it in an ampule under nitrogen to try to preserve those. But month by month, if you assayed that human growth hormone or oxytocin or vasopressin, you could see it very steadily decreased, because it runs down, it breaks up, and deteriorates. That is what nature does. That is what happens naturally. Now, of course, God could create. He overcame the laws of probability. He overcame these laws. You see, God created the natural processes on which we now base the second law of thermodynamics and the first law of thermodynamics. God created those natural processes. We didn't create them. We don't go out and command nature to obey certain laws. We just go out there and see what's going on. Then when we see what's going on, we try to describe it. And when something happens always the same way, we never find that it's violated. We never find that it changes. We call it a natural law. But that process, you see, God created that process. It obeys that natural law which God created.
We've moved out of the realm of science and into theology. I don't really know what else to say. That
One final question. Clearly the second law of and this is to Dr. Abel, clearly the second law of thermodynamics, that matter left to itself tends to disorganize, poses a strong argument against evolution and for creation. Perhaps an even stronger argument can be drawn from the first law of thermodynamics, that matter can be neither created nor destroyed. I asked Dr. Abel how he can explain the existence of original matter while being consistent with this law. Where did this original matter come from?
As I said, I certainly don't know. Just like for a long period of time, a lot of people didn't know a lot of different things. It doesn't mean that there is no answer to the question. It means that we simply don't know at this time. It has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It's simply a statement.
Well, I think someone who maintains you can explain everything naturally based upon natural laws is getting off to a bit of a bad start when he has to admit he can't even explain where the beginning came from. Where did matter come from in the first place? Ladies and gentlemen, there's two possibilities. Either matter is eternal or God is eternal. Our ultimate source, wherever it came from, had to exist forever. The first law of thermodynamics, naturally now, based upon natural laws, the first law says you can't get something from nothing. The total quantity of energy and matter in the universe is a constant. So if you say there is no God, then you have to say that matter is eternal. But that cannot be. The universe is running down. It's deteriorating. Obviously, it has not been here forever, because if it had have been here forever, it would have run down a long time ago. It hasn't run down yet, so it could not have been here forever. Dr. Robert Jastrow, who says he's an agnostic, a man who heads the Goddard Institute of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and professorship in a couple of universities, he says he's an agnostic, but he says from science we know the universe has not been here forever. There was a time when it did not exist, and then it came into existence. He said that brings us back to that biblical statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He says it's just as if scientists were climbing this mountain, and when they got to the top, they found the theologians had been sitting there all the time. So what he is saying, that matter could not have existed forever, this universe could not have existed forever. Now, the only other possibility is that God has existed forever. May I point out that it's precisely what the Bible claims for the existence of God. God has existed forever. You got your choice. Either hydrogen gas is your creator or God is your creator. Either matter has been here forever or God has been here forever. You can't believe that matter has been forever. It's a physical impossibility. Scientists now even believe the proton decays. Even the proton could not exist forever. So I think that does point, just as Dr. Jastrow said, it does points back to the eternal Creator.
Speaking of the second law of thermodynamics, I think I've been running down for about 30 minutes, and I would like to thank everyone for their kind attention. Good night.
Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. A set of keys has been turned in to me. If you are missing them, please step forward and claim them. Thanks again. Good night.
I'll have the keys if they're your keys, and you'll know it in a few minutes.